Chapter 6. The Lewis, the Library, and the Dynamic Duo. My 7th and 8th grade years blurred together in my mind. From late 1984 through mid-1986, when Channel 11 no longer showed Star Blazers, I watched the anime Robotech before my school's first bell, which I heard across the street from my and Wendy's bedroom. Having quit piano lessons after 6th grade, I was in 7th and then 8th grade concert choir and participated in Texas's University Interscholastic League choir competitions. Beginning in 1985, the school library was my twice-a-day pit stop, where I checked out a book to read over the school day and then checked out another book to read at home when I wasn't writing in my novel notebook. Like routine, I showed Jill what I wrote, and Jill showed me her Remington Steele's fan fiction, which often veered towards erotica, at lunchtime as we ate our dubious school cafeteria lunches. But above all, from 1984 to 1986, I was a student to 7th and 8th grade honors reading teacher Mrs. Bearden, and from 1985 to 1986, a student to 8th grade honors English teacher Mrs. Campbell. Although C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe had affected me as I flew over the Pacific when I was 10, I hadn't sought Lewis in the library as I adjusted to stateside, public schools, and a mostly civilian life in Texas. So I was happily surprised that Mrs. Bearden required her 7th and 8th grade students to buy all 7 of C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, which served as a cornerstone to Mrs. Bearden's class. Thanks to my middle school yearbook that I still have, I can remember Mrs. Bearden. She was 40-ish with short blonde hair, a quirky sense of humor, and a commanding presence in her classroom, even though she wasn't that much taller than I was. I stopped growing at 5'2" when I was 13 years old. I still remember a classmate who pushed her rules too far, too often, as a class clown. As a consequence, he stood in front of the class, his arms stretched out from his sides and his palms up, while Mrs. Bearden counted. If he dropped his arms, she restarted the count. For some foolish reason, he grinned and commented, "This is easy." So Mrs. Bearden found a couple of textbooks and put them on each outstretched hand, which instantly sagged and then dropped. She restarted her count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on until my classmate, his arms shaky and his face red with exertion, looked like he was about to crumple. "That's enough. Back to your seat." "Yes, ma'am." Rule 1 of honors reading, do not cross Mrs. Bearden. In spite of that, Mrs. Bearden's class was fun as we worked on year-long The Chronicles of Narnia reading portfolio projects. In 7th grade, my class covered Book 6, The Magician's Nephew, Book 1, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Book 2, Prince Caspian. In 8th grade, we covered Book 5, The Horse and His Boy, Book 3, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Book 4, The Silver Chair, and Book 7, The Last Battle. Mrs. Bearden disregarded the published order sequence of the series, which I learned years later was C.S. Lewis's intended order sequence, but we never questioned her why. See Rule 1. Mrs. Bearden's class was where I learned how to read a novel, not just for entertainment, but for comprehension and awareness of the nuts and bolts of fiction structure. We pulled back the surface skin of Lewis's story and peered into the inner structure, plot, character, and setting. In an age before Google and Wikipedia, Mrs. Bearden had us answer weekly reading comprehension questions and create character and setting summaries to demonstrate that we learned the secrets behind Lewis's fantasy books of world-hopping children and talking animals. At the end of each book unit, we compiled our answers and summaries into a portfolio folder that was supposed to look like a book with a cover, table of contents, number of pages, and an end page, 7 portfolios for 7 books. Since I loved Richard Haynes' cover illustrations, I copied them using colored pencils. My table of contents page for each portfolio were also illustrated with whimsical pictures that remind me of Lisa Frank folders, but less eyeball-screaming complexity and airbrush art. I even drew and colored illustrated section pages, usually characters from the book. All of the extra illustrations usually garnered me extra credit, but I didn't do them for the extra credit. I didn't need it. The process of constructing these heavily illustrated portfolios tapped into my desire to make a completed book, albeit a book that was hand-drawn and handwritten, again in neat cursive, with grading marks and dried whiteout smears here and there. So Mrs. Bearden fueled my imagination and knowledge of narrative structure, which made me a more conscientious writer. I learned how to rein in my tendency to ramble in writing that had poor structure or order. For it was easy for me to ramble, especially as life at home started to get complicated. Pause time at NAS Dallas came to a close, and his next duty station was deployment in Diego Garcia, a tiny atoll island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. This is where a military family couldn't go. If we moved, Mom, my siblings, and I would be stationed on a naval base in Naples, Italy, while Pa was overseas, gone from October 1985 to November 1986. Moving this time around was easier paperwork-wise since Mom, my siblings, and I all became naturalized U.S. citizens in the spring of 1983, and the prospect of living in Italy was exciting. But Mom didn't want to move. Cheryl, my youngest sister, started kindergarten in fall 1985, which meant all four of us kids would now be in school. Mom saw this as an opportunity to re-enter the workplace again. Also, the house, with its mortgage, was a hassle to put on the market, and Mom didn't want to sell the house anyway, since it was the first house that she actually owned. She had redecorated the house to her tastes, grew a flourishing garden in the backyard, and knew all the stores, amenities, and the Filipino-American diaspora within driving distance. In 3 years, Texas became her home. So Pa would go, but we would stay. Before Pa left, Mom and Pa renovated the house. They turned the two-car garage into a huge spare room, which was divided into a home office and Eric's own bedroom. Wendy and Cheryl shared Eric's former bedroom, and I stayed where I was, now alone in my own bedroom with a full-size bed and my own TV. Mom and Pa also renovated the living room as they paneled the wall, changed living room sofa sets, and bought a new TV. It was as if Mom was nesting, but without the baby. One of the last things Pa did before he left was bring home a dark tan IBM Selectra 2 typewriter. Along with the machine were its supply of ribbon cartridges, spools of correcting tape, a removable typing ball which came in different fonts like Courier and Times Roman. His office had phased out these old typewriters and had already written off the stock. Even though Pa bought an Apple IIe computer from the commissary last year, we didn't have a printer. While I practiced my typing with the Mavis Beacon Teaches typing program, I couldn't print what I typed. Pa realized this deficit and instead of spending more money on a printer, got a free typewriter that, on paper, the Navy had thrown away. Pa set up this electric on a little table on the new garage office. He plugged it in, turned it on, and heard the low hum of the typewriter's inner workings. "Here," he said to me, "let me show you how to use this." Then he showed me how to put the sheet of paper, how to set the margins, how hard to type on the keys, and oh boy, that typing while was loud, how to backspace to correct a mistake, and so on. It had an auto carriage return that gave a satisfying ding when it hit the left-hand margin. "Isn't it easy?" he asked. "Now you can type your reports for school." "Yes, Pa," I replied. But I wasn't required to type my school assignments. Instead, I intended to type up my second novel once I was finished, except that Pa didn't know that. Actually, no one in my family knew that I was writing a novel in that little notebook, and I preferred it that way. Writing that second novel became a way for me to have control when everything changing around me was beyond my control. Although my siblings would now be in school, Mom was looking for a job for the first time in years, Pa was leaving for Diego Garcia, and my body was changing and doing weird things that frankly disgusted and distressed me, even though, intellectually, I knew what was happening. My 13th year of existence just plain sucked. So I wrote. I wrote instead of pulling out my hair or starving myself whenever I felt anxious. I became obsessive about my novel. I brought my notebook like a security blanket to Filipino parties, shopping trips, and even church. I wrote every day, well into the night. By the end of the summer of 1985, I was done. Then, following the look of a published book because I didn't know any better, 3-space indents, single-spaced, I typed. I typed like a transcription machine and saw my novel as a bunch of words to copy. Therefore, I didn't see my bad writing habits. While I didn't have a problem in the quantity of my words, I still chose big words and wrote long, convoluted sentences in the mistaken idea that I sounded clever and smart that way. Soon, a special kind of teacher taught me the basics of clear writing and correct English, and I learned this in a way that isn't really taught anymore, but it should. In the fall of 1985, in my final year of middle school, I was not only Mrs. Bearden's student again, but also a new student of Mrs. Campbell. Like Mrs. Bearden, Mrs. Campbell wasn't very tall, had a quirky sense of humor, and had a commanding presence in her classroom. She was like a brunette, younger Mrs. Bearden. Predictably, they were co-sponsors of the National Junior Honor Society and educational partners as they linked their honors reading and honors English classes together. Mrs. Campbell's classroom was in one of the small worn and portable buildings adjacent to the main brick-and-mortar building, a testimony to Truman's increased student body size. The first thing we students did as soon as we sat in our seats was to diagram the sentence that Mrs. Campbell had written on the chalkboard. We sat down, got out our special notebook that was dedicated to sentence diagramming, and worked the sentence out. These morning exercises are why I credit Mrs. Campbell with demystifying the English language to me. While I was fluent in speaking, reading, and writing in English, I never understood the logic behind English syntax. Why did a sentence look like that way, and if it's wrong, why? Up to that point, I just memorized word lists and rules. Sentence diagramming, therefore, was a revelation. Subject plus verb plus predicate made sense. Modifiers and clauses and phrases made sense. The 7 parts of speech made sense. Commas, even commas, made sense. English grammar and syntax weren't just arbitrary things. They had a structure and logic that was just like math, and I like math. Meanwhile, every time I finished typing up a chapter, I showed my type pages to Jill or to Nikki, a new friend that I made in my honors pre-algebra class when we exchanged cartoon notes about a superhero pig and his sidekick frog. Each time, both Jill and Nikki gave a thumbs up to whatever I wrote. Jill often reminded me, "Remember to make a copy. No use moping about losing another one." "Gee," I'd reply, "thanks for the reminder." But as much as I appreciated my friends' support, I knew I made grammar mistakes. I needed expert advice. I don't recall how Mrs. Campbell found out about my novel. Maybe she overheard me talking about it to a classmate, or I bluntly asked her to read my manuscript. I just remember when Mrs. Campbell held up the portfolio folder that held the loose type pages of my entire novel and asked, "Do you mind if I make a copy of this?" "Yes, please." After about 2 or 3 weeks before class began, Mrs. Campbell returned her copy of my manuscript in its own folder. Opening the folder, I saw that she meticulously corrected every grammar, diction, and punctuation mistake that I made in 2 color pens. One was in green, the other one was in red. At first I was overwhelmed by the sea of editing marks on every page of my manuscript, but then I recognized the handwriting of the red pen. "That's Mrs. Bearden's pen," I commented. "Yes," Mrs. Campbell confirmed. "We both read your novel." "Oh, God," I cringed. "It's really bad, isn't it?" "What? No!" Mrs. Campbell crouched next to my desk. A real feat, since she was often in heels. "You wrote this before you taking this class, right?" "Yes." "So most of my marks are mistakes that you don't make on your assignments anymore. Run-ons, comma splices, fragments, passive voice. Mrs. Bearden noticed that you tend to choose complicated words and sentence constructions when a simple one will do. That's called word choice. A writer's voice comes through his or her word choices and how it fits with what he or she is writing. Your story is good. I love that frog oolong as a secret phrase for the clubhouse, but your third-person narrative voice is cluttering the flow of your story. How do I fix that?" "Well," Mrs. Campbell said as she looked up and noticed that most of my classmates were already in their desks as the tardy bell rang, "you can retype your draft, fixing all the errors that Mrs. Bearden and I noticed. And when you type your second draft, have 1-inch margins all around, indent 5 spaces for the first sentence of each paragraph, and double-space everything. That's what professional writers do." "Oh, okay." "But the secret to good writing is reading good books, which I know you'll do." She smiled, winked at me as she stood up, and pointed to the sentence diagramming exercise on the chalkboard for the class to do. From that day on, I increased my library visits from whenever I felt like it or was required to go, which I did for 6th and 7th grade, to at least twice a day. I checked out a book first thing in the morning after the first bell, but before my first class, and read it at any available free time during and between my classes. I even got in trouble one time when I read a book before my choir class started. I didn't notice that the bell had rung and Mr. Dunn, the choir director, was talking. "Raphael? Raphael? Raphael? What?" "Oh," I looked around. "Sorry, Mr. Dunn." Already familiar with Madame L'Engle, I read every book the school library had of hers. At the recommendation of the librarian, I read Lloyd Alexander's A Chronicle of Prydain and his Westmark trilogy. I read sci-fi books by William Slater, starting with Interstellar Pig. I read Margaret Mahy's books and loved The Changeover so much that I bought a copy as soon as I could afford it. I read trippy books by Daniel Manas Pinkwater and coming-of-age novels by Paula Danziger and Judy Blume. I read lots of teen problems novels like Emmy Kerr's Dinky Hawker Shoots Smack. I still love that title. And Paul Zindel's The Pigman, which taught me how an unhappy ending didn't have to mean a meaningless story. I read books by authors I don't even remember now. When one considers that a typical school year has 180 weekdays in it, holidays excluded, then that's a lot of library books I checked out by the time I graduated from 8th grade. In many respects, the school library became a second home to me. Thus I, along with my science class, was comfortable in the library on the late morning of January 28, 1986. I felt optimistic that day. I had my new second draft typed up and ready to show Mrs. Campbell. In a fit of youthful confidence, I even submitted a copy, after spending lots of dimes in the library's copier, to a publisher I found in the writer's market that I read and took notes when I sat in Century Books but didn't buy. I had submitted some of my poems and short stories to a local citywide writing contest. Mr. Dunn designated me for his soprano and choir class, and I look forward to my last choir concerts and competitions in middle school. Even though I gave up my astronaut dreams, I wore that day my jean jacket that had a stitched-on official STS-6 Challenger mission patch, which I won when I submitted tons of Tang proof of purchases. My class and I were watching a live TV feed of the launch of the space shuttle Challenger. That was the one with the first teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe. 1986 truly felt like a brand new year. Then the horror happened. As we watched Challenger break up in the sky, many of my classmates didn't know what they were witnessing. I wasn't one of them. Thanks to my early obsession with space exploration, I had read about the earlier disasters, especially the Apollo 1 fire and the near-disaster Apollo 13 mission. I had seen video footage of successful shuttle launches, and I instantly knew something had gone catastrophically wrong. I stood there stunned. School ended early that day. Eric and Cheryl were still at Dickinson. Mom was at her new job at a Dallas hospital cafeteria, and Pa was on the other side of the world. So Wendy and I crossed the street to an empty house. I went to my room and stared at the handmade banner of the solar system and my drawings of the space shuttle. Then I pulled up Madeline L'Engle's A Swiftly Tilting Planet and skimmed through the pages. Almost near the end of the book, I paused at a passage. I jumped up, rifled through my arts and craft box, and found a white cardstock paper, gold and purple paint markers, and a thick calligraphy pen. After an hour of copying from the book and then making margin embellishments in gold and purple, I placed this new poster above my doorway. I place all heaven with its power, and the sun with its brightness, and the snow with its whiteness, and the fire with all the strength it hath, and the lightning with its rapid wrath, and the winds with their swiftness along their path, and the sea with its deepness, and the rocks with their steepness, and the earth with its starkness. All these I place, by God's almighty help and grace, between myself and the powers of darkness. At age 13, I wasn't a particularly devout Catholic Christian. Mom often pulled double shifts and weekends at her new job, which cut into Sunday school and church attendance. But this was the closest to prayer I offered to the lost Challenger crew that day. Good God, that was a sad day. I felt the same way over 15 years later when I saw on live TV 2 passenger jets hit the Twin Towers on the morning of September 11. After the Challenger disaster, the last semester of 8th grade was surreal. First, a Filipino family acquaintance who was the same age as me and I sometimes saw in the school hallways as well as at a few Filipino fiestas, became pregnant and had to drop out of the 8th grade. This brought back the memory of reading about the pregnant 12-year-old in Reader's Digest. Then, I won a couple of ribbons in my age group in the city writing contest, but then received the first of many rejection letters from book and magazine publishers. It was almost funny. I also found out that Nikki was moving away, and possibly Jill, since her parents were divorcing. I fought the panic of losing 2 of my closest friends, even though, for a change, I wasn't the one moving anywhere. Finally, I played flag football for the last time during one of those free days when the PE classes were co-ed. I ran for a touchdown in a mad panic, glanced back at the last moment, and immediately collided into one of the goalposts, which knocked me out flat. When I came to, I saw that Coach Lowe, a towering African-American man, had kneeled down and leaned over me. "Are you okay, darling?" Yeah, I groaned as I sat up. "Did I make the touchdown?" Coach Lowe laughed as he pointed to the football still clutching my arm. "Darling," he said, "maybe you shouldn't be playing football." A few weeks later, the choir rehearsed for the end-of-year concert, which included walking down in single file from the risers, the stage, and across the cafeteria. I had made it halfway through the cafeteria when I slipped on a slick spot, landed flat on my back, and knocked myself out again. Like a bad case of deja vu, I saw a teacher, this time it was Mr. Dunn, the choir director, leaning over me. "Are you okay?" he asked me. Do you know where you are?" On a floor?" I was escorted to the nurse's office where I rested until I recovered from my second minor concussion. Since the rehearsal was after school anyway, and in the 1980s concussions were just one of those things that one just shook off, I went home to lie down. As I said, it was a surreal last semester. Whether it was the double concussion, Mrs. Bearden's clever lesson planning, or my clueless lack of biblical knowledge as a cradle Catholic, I never realized at the time that C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia paralleled the Bible and had Christian pedagogy when I read the books and made those portfolios. They were grand fantasy adventure stories where children got to be heroes by doing what was brave and not what was easy, and I loved the books as such. In that respect, Mrs. Bearden gave me and her students a strong education in ethics, without us realizing it because it was wrapped up in story. In fact, it was better that it was hidden and woven in story. To this day, I can point to my honors reading and English classes and say, that's where I believe I could be a writer someday. As an autodidact, I can teach myself with books, but it takes special teachers to point the way beyond those books and the limited worldview of the reader, to stories yet to be written, to truths yet to be realized. Those kind of teachers can make private readers into public writers. The dynamic duo that was Mrs. Bearden and Mrs. Campbell were those teachers. The last words they gave me were penned in my middle school yearbook in perfect schoolteacher cursive. Over Mrs. Bearden's photo was the message, "I look forward to reading some published novels someday. Keep that goal. Love, Mrs. B." Under Mrs. Campbell's photo was the message, "To my frog-oolong novelist, I expect to get a discount when your novels are on the bestseller list. Please keep in touch. You are one of the most talented student writers I've had the pleasure of teaching. Love, Mrs. C." Sadly, in my 14-year-old immaturity, I didn't keep in touch, as the whirlwind of high school life kept me occupied, even though they were across the street from my house. Also, along the way, all copies of my second attempt of a novel disappeared, which is why I can't even remember the title of it, except for a snippet that I later revised for an assignment when I was in grad school. But even that snippet never got published. However, even as time and space have widened between them and me, Mrs. Bearden's and Mrs. Campbell's words of encouragement to a shy, mixed-up teen girl when she most needed it have stuck with me all of these years. Even though I never became the best-selling prolific novelist that I dreamed of being when I was that girl, I did keep the goal of being a writer and, what would have been surprising to the younger me, becoming a teacher of writing as well. They believed that I could, and I did.